is Wednesday. We don't know what day it is, but it is May 13th. I guess I should say I'm told it's Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. Dangerous Shortcuts, Keeping Church Finances on a Safe Path. My name is Adrienne Billis. I am the Director of Leadership at Episcopal Church Foundation. I am your tech guru today, and I just wanted to quickly introduce our lead presenters. Demi Prentiss, and now let me see here. Demi Prentiss is below me. I always feel like I'm on the Brady Bunch here. She is below me, Demi Prentiss. Demi is a Jackie of all trades. She is a program consultant in the Endowment Management Solutions Division here at ECF. She supports dioceses, congregations in structuring and growing their endowments. But that's not all. She really comes to us with incredible experience and wisdom. She was ministry developer in her Diocese of Fort Worth. She also served on the presiding bishop's staff. And if I could add a little tidbit, she is our editing guru for our finance resource guide, which we have just released. And now we're working on the Spanish finance resource guide, and she is on our team as well. So she is working on many different things with us. Carsten Sierck is Program Director for Endowment Management. On my screen, she's next to me. So I'm always not sure, where we're looking here, but Program Director for Endowment Management, Planned Giving, and Donor Solutions at ECF. She advises churches, dioceses, schools, and a whole kind of handful of other Episcopal organizations. She has a law background, so she brings to us today both finance and law, which is an awesome combination for our viewers today, for our constituents, and really for our larger ECF community. So two people with incredible wisdom here to share today. Before I'm quiet, just want to do a quick tech. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box. Please feel free to type in your questions or comments. We will take those once our presentation is done. Please feel free to also add in the Q&A, which is right next to the chat box. I will be monitoring both of those. So please feel free to use whatever you feel comfortable. And as we get ready here, we are hoping to go live on Facebook so that we can grab some questions and comments from there. Facebook's a little slow today, so we'll see what we can do. But by all means, as we always say, as you digest this and leave us once we're done, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, just tidbits that you want to talk about, please feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to talk with you, share our wisdom, and keep these conversations going. So without further ado, Demi, let me pass it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you, Carsten, for being here. I think that we're going to have some fun. I have been charged to hold this up in front of the camera. This is our newly published finance resource guide, newly, I guess, in November. This is not a guide to dangerous shortcuts, but this book has helped us examine some of the dangerous shortcuts that might be easy to fall into. And there's lots of practice and best practices sort of advice, guidance, and some things to think about in here. It's particularly aimed at helping you and your congregation be in conversation about money, which is something we mustn't do, right? Except we're Christians and we know we have to talk about it. So anyway, that's not the guide to get dangerous shortcuts. It's your safeguard. It's your map. You may be wondering, what in the world do we mean by dangerous shortcuts? And I know you have all been in this situation. You're driving along the freeway, the highway, and you see up ahead of you, the cars are starting to stack up, and I'm going to get stuck in a traffic jam, and everything slows up, and you're in start and stop. And then over on your right, there's this guy in the SUV, and he's got his four-wheel drive revved up, and he's just jumping the curb and driving across the grass, and some of it's pretty tall, but he's doing all right, except for the fact that he falls into a ditch that he couldn't see because of the tall grass. And maybe damages his car, but certainly doesn't get anywhere faster than anybody else, and he's stuck, and it's a mess. You know, he probably has a trip to the repair shop and a lot of wasted time. Each of us who manage funds for a congregation, we're stewards, and every once in a while we find ourselves tempted to sort of jump the median or go over to the access road and see if we can avoid having to slog through some of the details that seem not quite so important, or they're holding us up and we've really got to deal with the situation. It's really easy when you're disrupted to look at these, to be tempted by shortcuts. We're in a pandemic, so that may be a temptation, or maybe your congregation experienced a tornado and there's hardly a building there, or maybe your whole town got flooded. All of those are disruptions that really test our financial policies and procedures, because they're the guardrails that keep us from running into the ditch. So beware of urgency or lack of funds, or just, this is so much trouble, thinking that might tempt you to take shortcuts that can endanger both your congregation's standing in the community, but also its very existence. So we're going to be focusing on three primary areas of concern. Because we all function as stewards, as fiduciaries for the money that our congregation receives. Our policies are one big area, and they demonstrate our intent. Our accountability and our transparency, those demonstrate our trustworthiness in good times and in bad times. And finally, our commitment to good decision making, both process and recognition of what's involved there, demonstrate our integrity. So those three areas are really a huge, our main emphasis of focus in this time together. Carsten, you were going to start us off talking about some policy.
Sure. So as Demi mentioned, every church leader has a legal and moral responsibility to safeguard church assets. And to do that, as we know, it's important to act with care and to establish and document church goals, diocesan requirements, donor intent, committee intent, applicable law, best practices for churches, and really even standard business practices. If not, there certainly is potential liability. There's also a potential lack of trust that could develop. And of course, trust is the spirit of your church. It's the welcome that you give to members. It's the way you carry out your mission. It's also a signal to potential donors who are in and around your church. The dangerous shortcut here is to ignore policies and procedures because it's a health pandemic, and because now we are having an economic crisis resulting from that. We're not in the building, we're not meeting regularly, we're not worshiping as we usually do. Donations are down, costs are up, costs are unexpected. We need to pay bills now. There may also be, in some cases, fewer people available to fill needed roles, and perhaps a sense of time pressure or looming deadlines. It's tempting to do, to just simply do right now what needs to be done, or what you hope can be done, and to do it by yourself, perhaps, do it right now, just once, just for the short term. And perhaps that is with the very best of intentions, because we're a church with a mission to serve. It's rooted in our faith. But instead, I think we would like to highlight some other ways to act now instead.
Well, it's really important to stick to the intent of the policies that you created along the way, perhaps when you weren't quite so stressed. And remember that you established those practices, those policies, after you reviewed practices and decided how you were gonna proceed, how you were going to safeguard the assets of your church. It's really important that you do that to provide continuity and to provide guidance to the leaders who come after you. And sticking to your policies demonstrate your capable management. They build trust, as Carsten was saying, among the congregation and future donors and the community. And in financial matters, trust is the bedrock of everything you do in your congregation. The good policies ensure that the funds are safe, but they also ensure that your people are safe, because they help make sure that your people are accusation proof, that they won't be operating in good faith and doing the right thing, but doing it all by themselves, so they're open to being accused of mismanagement. One of the main places that this shows up is in cash handling. And okay, we're not right now taking plate donations, but you have checks arriving in the mail, probably. Those need to be handled practically like cash. You want to make sure that you observe your segregation of duties. I know you're shorthanded. I know it'd be so much easier to have that person go to the post office, pick up the checks, do the deposit, and just put it in the bank. You're not safeguarding your person, as well as not really having great records of what you've received. So stick to your cash handling policies. And in receiving gifts, it's really important to be quite clear, even before you ask, what are the funds going to be collected for? We all remember the disaster that Red Cross ran into when they failed to say for this and other disasters during 9/11, and some of the money that was given for 9/11 still sits in the bank, unpayable, outable, because of that restriction. That's just crazy. So make sure your procedures include good record keeping and acknowledgement of gifts, all the things you know what you're supposed to do, timely statements, quarterly and annually. Make sure especially that the congregation understands both the sources of your income and where you're spending them. You do that normally through audits, but now you're needing to communicate, because your people who support you with their funds love your church. That's why they give you money. And to help them understand that you're in a tight place helps them support you at a time that it's most needed.
Yeah. So Demi talked there so nicely about cash coming into your church now, new gifts. I also want to turn to policies around any longer term or invested or endowment funds that you may have, first touching on the purpose of those funds. So let's say you have a fund intended for something pretty specific, like maybe children's music. The dangerous shortcut now is to spend some of that on operations because you have a gap and here are some funds. But if the purpose has been set by a donor, then you can't deviate from that purpose. It's the law around these types of funds. And to do so would also undermine trust in the church and its leadership, and that can undermine future giving. So you must continue to use funds set aside by a donor for their intended purpose. There are some ways to modify the purpose of those funds. This may not apply to too many of you, but it's worth knowing about just in case. One is if your donor is still living. You can go back to that donor and discuss a release of the restrictions. Many churches do get long-term endowment funds as part of a bequest or some sort of end-of-life gift, but from time to time, a church might have had an endowment campaign, or perhaps be working with a donor who makes part of a gift while living and intends to make a subsequent gift later on at the end of life. So there you could certainly go back to a donor. The other two cases, one is if the purpose, if it's impossible or impracticable to carry out the purpose of the funds. And the final one is if you have small or old funds, that's often funds under $25,000 or so, and funds that you might have had for more than 20 years. In both of those cases, impossible, impracticable, and small and old, you do need to work with your State Attorney General's office and modify them in a way that continues to maintain some sort of charitable intent. But there are options there. Again, that's going to be fewer of you, but for those of you, to whom it does apply, it could actually be quite important right now. These are all in connection with funds set aside by a donor. In contrast, if a fund was set aside by a vestry, and the vestry set the purpose of that fund, maybe only for capital improvements or mission and ministry, the vestry can modify the purpose of those funds itself, either by a new vestry resolution or under whatever terms were set by an earlier vestry. It's always a good idea to build in some flexibility when you can, and certainly with any new funds that you set aside, and this would be a good moment now perhaps to review the purpose of any vestry designated invested funds. If you take the dangerous shortcut and spend on a purpose other than intended, it certainly can land you in court or make some potential donors skeptical, and over the long term, that's going to really have an impact on the church's ability to raise future funds. So that's the purpose of invested funds. I also want to touch briefly on spending from invested funds. If a fund set aside for the long term, perhaps you call it an endowment fund, perhaps has another name, if that fund is intended to last forever, you may only spend prudently from it today so that there are funds to use in the future also. The dangerous shortcut is to spend more now, even though that's not permitted, because there's tremendous need. It's a pandemic, maybe your revenue has dropped, your investment returns are down, account values are lower. Again, this opens you up to challenge because there's an agreement between a donor and the church that the funds must last in perpetuity. Interestingly, though, there's another risk for some churches, which is almost the opposite, and that's to spend less now because your investments are down. This is a very good time to refer to your spending policy and rely on it, and to continue to spend the same percentage of your account. Make sure it's prudent, but then stick to it. And so just like you don't spend more when markets are up, like last year, you don't spend less when markets are down. There are things that you can do from an operational point of view to build in some smoothing mechanisms to reduce the impact of market fluctuations. That could include calculating your draw over a 12-quarter rolling average, and also taking your distribution periodically throughout the year rather than all at once. If you were planning to take it all at once and your date was March 31st of this year, that would have been a difficult time to take a distribution. So that doesn't change how you spend, but it's sort of mechanical, but those are very important things that you can review right now. Separately, again, you can also, it's good to know when or if you can spend more deeply than that prudent amount. That would be if you have funds set aside by the vestry as endowment funds or quasi-endowment funds that permit distributions that are more than a prudent amount in certain circumstances. So we often talk that for vestry designated funds, it's a good idea to build in some flexibility when you can. A good question to ask right now would be, how can we spend more deeply if we have to, and how should we be able to use those funds in an emergency? There's sort of a delicate balance there between protecting the funds to encourage future giving, but giving you some flexibility to address really remarkable circumstances. So these, Demi and I have covered quickly here some dangerous shortcuts around church financial policies and procedures, and certainly feel free to type in a question. Many of us are facing these issues right now, and we can certainly learn from one another. But we're going to turn now to a second area, which is financial accountability.
Thanks, Carsten. And accountability and transparency are really, really important considerations when you are operating in a difficult period. And Carsten was just speaking about the vestry making changes in how they spend funds. And that's one example of a time when accountability and transparency are essential to making sure that the congregation is on board. Accountability and transparency, you know, are essential. They're especially important in good times because you want to show how you're using the bounty that's before you, or at least the sufficiency. And in those good times, when you are accountable and transparent, the congregation learns to trust the leaders, to be able to count on their decisions, and to see how that moves the congregation forward. All of that communication becomes even more important in hard times when moving forward is harder to see and everyone is pretty anxious. But modeling through accountability and transparency that you make wise decisions, that you use resources well, that you care for one another as well as for financial gifts, it demonstrates that you are following the directions of your donors, and it safeguards your assets. So setting out your management practice helps people trust you and reflects our faith in good operations and in a God that is good to us. Good leaders know that being forthcoming with accurate information, up-to-date information about the church finances helps keep the funds and the leaders and the congregation safe.
Yeah. No, certainly, Demi, you're exactly right. And, you know, we all know really the optimal way to proceed in ideal circumstances. And I think it's important to keep that idea in place, even in difficult circumstances. The dangerous shortcut right now is that you might stop being transparent about money because the picture isn't pretty or it's not what you planned. Perhaps sharing information threatens someone's power, or the story may be hard to tell, or the story may be complicated, maybe too complicated for them to understand. There also might be a worry that money truth will undermine a sense of vibrancy. And this sort of pause in transparency could happen certainly between church leaders and the congregation, but it can also happen among church leaders as they wrestle with the unplanned and unexpected, but certainly there are things to keep in mind instead.
Yeah, your protection against this dangerous shortcut is open up rather than close down. And hard times always make us feel a little bit like closing down, circling the wagons. That applies individually and to your vestry, to your congregation, about what is happening in your congregation. Open up more perhaps than you ever have when offering that reporting, both live, quote unquote live, via Zoom, however you do your announcements or communicate with your congregation, as well as all the ways of communicating, are really important. And when the congregation gets up-to-date information, their trust and confidence is reinforced and they unclench a little bit. It's good spiritually for us, it's good physically for us, and it keeps the information flowing back from them as well. And when they feel more confident, they have the knowledge to respond generously about the support that your congregation needs. really times of crisis, times of disruption are times to even risk over communicating to make sure that people understand the situation.
Yeah.
So you can do that also in meetings, and especially there's a temptation, oh, too much is going on, we just can't do this meeting. The finance committee can wait till next month. That's really the time to make sure you hold those scheduled meetings, maybe even more often. Open them up to people who want to just come and watch you work. Post the minutes online or on the bulletin board of the congregation if you folks have access to it. Consider making interim reports to the congregation, even in between those scheduled ones. Communicating in that way is clarity and transparency, but it also builds relationship among your people. And when they feel confident they know what's going on, it's easier for you to engage with them and them with one another about how to support the congregation.
Yeah. No, Demi's exactly right. And another really important part of transparency is simply education. Talk about what your funds are for. It's really a dangerous shortcut to assume that everybody already knows or that they don't need to know. So I would encourage you to talk about your cash reserves policy, why you have that amount set aside. Talk about any endowment funds you have, how they're restricted as to purpose and as to spending, and why. People, I mean, the risk for endowed churches, which certainly isn't going to be everybody, but the risk for endowed churches is that members of the congregation say, but I thought we had all this money. And it's really a good opportunity to have a dialogue with them about how your funds are set aside and what they're intended to be used for. It's also very valuable to talk openly about what you're doing with your new gifts and why. Demi talked about this earlier, but there's certainly an opportunity to talk about, right now, to tell stories about how you're reacting as a church and as a community to this crisis, to inspire others around their giving. Perhaps you have new outreach efforts or you're supporting your own community in new ways. Talking about this, telling both the stories, but also giving the practical, detailed information is essential. It really helps you reassure the congregation and also set a tone. This is our church. Here is what we have and why. Here is what we are doing together. And here is why we will thrive. This is a relational approach that's valuable at all times and also very important for future giving. Another area of transparency I just want to touch on is around fiduciary responsibility. We talked about that earlier, but transparency is very necessary for church leaders to carry out their fiduciary responsibilities, their own responsibilities, and also make it possible for others to carry out their responsibilities. The dangerous shortcut is to make that harder to do, possibly just unintentionally. It's very important to make reasoned decisions with up-to-date information. It's important to attend meetings, to communicate consistently among yourselves and with your advisors, and review any changing conditions. It's very much a risk to not do this now because it's difficult to do so. It's also a dangerous shortcut not to continue scheduled turnover of the vestry or finance or investment committees. It's tempting to do so, and we've had some inquiries about this, tempting to do so because meetings are just not as they normally are right now. But instead, I encourage you to adapt your training, consider your online meeting effectiveness. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. Don't ruffle feathers or undermine trust in church leaders to manage in difficult times by holding off on any turnover. So Demi and I have talked about these first two topics, policies and transparency, and those are both pretty straightforward. I know we do have a question about how to access our policies, and I can certainly send you an email, or please send either Demi or me an email, and we have sample policies that we can share with you. I just want to touch very quickly on another question relating to policies before we go to our last category. Another question here is, if a church closes, what happens to a restricted endowment if the donor and relatives are not living? So that would be a question that we can certainly help you with on your one-on-one, but the first place to go is probably to look at the documents that you have and then to be in touch with your diocese. There certainly are recommendations and expectations there, but we're happy to help you in that case as well. I also want to just mention then, since we've talked first about policies and transparency, we're going to turn now to something that's not quite as often talked about, but it's very important, and that is thinking about your decision-making process.
Now, that can be a little tricky, and the trickiest part about it is it's largely unconscious to us. How we make decisions is not something that we're always aware of, and we make assumptions that other people don't share. So it's important to put those assumptions out on the table. Like, oh, well, the rector always makes that decision. Well, actually, no, it's a vestry decision. Or, well, the vestry's always decided that. Well, actually, what our policies say is that requires a congregational vote. Our assumptions about who makes decisions and how those decisions are made, consensus, majority, secret ballot, all of those assumptions can send things awry when we're particularly tempted to take a dangerous shortcut, because the wrong person steps up to make the decision and you're off on a dangerous track already. The other really tricky part is our cognitive biases. And now bias has got a bad rep out there. To say I'm biased is a huge confession. Well, we all are, because we all have brains and our brains take shortcuts. And bias is nothing more than a cognitive shortcut. I happen to be biased against orange clothes. You'll notice I'm not wearing any. I never look at orange clothes on the rack. I never buy orange clothes. That's one of my biases. We all have them because bias is innate in the way our brains function. Now, the trouble is the dangerous shortcut is making decisions without recognizing the bias or the decision-making process that we have agreed on the process. The bias, it's just hardwired in there, and it can really undermine good decision-making, and that's more likely than ever right now, because anytime that we feel we're under threat, our brains don't work as well as they do when we feel safe. This part, our prefrontal cortex just steps aside to a greater or lesser extent when we feel anxious. And when we feel anxious, to be very clear about who's making this decision and what are my unconscious biases in looking at this decision. That's a dangerous, dangerous shortcut, and most of us are completely unaware of that. So the important protection against that dangerous shortcut is raising awareness of both of those factors, the decision-making process and our own bias. Particularly to guard against bias, create a strategy screen that you apply to the decisions you make. Kind of like Rotary's four-way test. Most people know about that. And one of the provisions is it fair to all concerned? Or are we true to our values? or are we true to our policies? Cultivate diversity among your decision-making bodies, and that doesn't always mean ethnic or cultural diversity. It might mean socioeconomic. It might be educational. It might mean all kinds of things. When you're faced with a decision, do as Scripture advises, prove through testing, which means, well, how would Joe feel about that decision? Or how might Hermione react if we were to do that? If Joe and Hermione can't be in the room, maybe you can bring them in the room just by remembering them and what they care about. Make sure your decisions are timely, because disruptive times, we can't afford to get paralyzed when our prefrontal cortex wants to take a vacation. We can't get paralyzed. We need to make timely decisions, but putting the awareness of how we make decisions and what steers our decision making in an unconscious way is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give a couple of examples, and then Demi will give a couple of examples. The first one that's interesting is the idea of recency bias, which is when you most readily remember something that happened recently and you forget what happened some time ago. The risk is giving undue emphasis to a recent event, perhaps a pandemic, when in fact that's highly unusual. And the dangerous shortcut in decision making is to be unaware of your recency bias and to make long-term financial decisions based on the most recent short-term event. So this would be especially important now when thinking about how you invest long-term or perpetual funds, and why, rather than deciding I'm going to put my funds under my mattress, it's why it's very important to have well thought out investment and other church policies around your financial affairs. A similar bias is optimism bias, and that's when you think that you are less likely than anyone else to experience a negative event. And this is another one to watch for now. Right now, it actually feels like the opposite of recency bias. But the dangerous shortcut here is to think, well, that won't ever happen to us, and avoid planning for something that you should plan for. Some of you, for example, may now realize that you have been operating with some optimism bias, perhaps around emergency funds, for example. So this might be a good time to take a look at your policies and find a balance. Don't overweight recent events, but do plan for the unexpected.
But another bias that most of us are aware of is what's called anchoring bias. And anybody who's ever bought anything has probably experienced a salesman practicing what they call in the trade anchoring. This kit is worth $1,000, but today only you can buy it for $500. Well, all of a sudden you feel like you're getting a great bargain with the $500 price when you wouldn't have guessed it was over $50 or $100, but now your whole idea of the price has been anchored upward. Well, how does that apply to a vestry or a church or anything? Well, anchoring doesn't always have to do with money. Who speaks first in your meeting? Who gets to say what the big question that we're going to deal with right now is? I don't want to say that extroverts like me are wrong all the time or shouldn't be listened to, but let's all be aware that what comes out of somebody's mouth first may not actually be the most important thing. And it might be that extrovert's first thought without it being inhibited by the thought process. So that's just drawing that to awareness that the first thing we talk about or think about might not be the right anchor for our thinking. Another bias that we all have heard a lot about, especially in the news, is what's called confirmation bias. We all practice this. We give greater credence and are more interested in information that confirms what we already believe. And something contrary to what we believe, well, it's pretty clear this is going to be a V-shaped recession. I don't know that. That's an example. I'm not telling you that. But if that confirms our own bias, then, well, Sam the investor said that that's true, and I know it must be. Well, is it really? Can we ask about that? Another bias that's a little similar is false consensus, because everyone who's sensible and well-meaning thinks like me, right? Of course we all think this way. Well, no. And somebody with different experience is probably going to have a different thought. They may reach the same conclusion, but getting there is part of the process, and that's part of decision making, is making sure that we're hearing from people who aren't the first voice or aren't the loudest voice, or who are accustomed to being invited to contribute to the conversation. All of those biases and assumptions set us up to drive ourselves into a ditch by mistake. They're largely unconscious. We're not bad people because we think that way. These are brain shortcuts that everyone has in practices. And so it's important for us to be aware of them. They all function to undermine trust ultimately in our decision making if our decisions are made on the wrong basis. Just in the same way that shortcuts about our I lost my train of thought, sorry. Just like shortcuts about our policies and shortcuts around accountability and transparency can help take us down the wrong road. Carsten, it's all yours.
No, absolutely. So please feel free, by the way, to write in now with any questions or comments, or to get in touch with Demi or me later by email. This is a very unusual time, and we are here to help churches avoid dangerous financial shortcuts that might undermine future financial planning and stability, but are also always a resource for any of you around the financial issues that you may have. We have focused today on 3 areas: policies, how they show your intent; transparency, how it shows your trustworthiness; and decision making, and how it really helps your integrity. As Demi mentioned at the beginning, another very valuable resource for you is ECF's new Finance Resource Guide. It is super friendly, very easy to use, and has a wonderful visual graphic design that I think is really very appealing. You can order that directly from forwardmovement.org. And then just a heads up, on June 10th, we are hosting another webinar, another conversation like this, based on our Finance Resource Guide, but looking at planning for the future after this crisis. It's going to be called Future Focus Your Finances, and we certainly look forward to that conversation with you as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carsten and Demi, for your wisdom, for sharing. You'll see that I've shared my screen. So Susan, I believe you asked a specific question about policies. Carsten mentioned to send her an email, so please see her email right there. As always, right, we can talk to you over email, phone, Zoom. We are quite available even during these stressful times. And as we conclude today, I just want to remind everyone, in case you have members of your vestry or members, community, parish, leadership in your church, if they were not able to make it today, please let them know that we will be posting a recording on our website, which is www.ecfvp.org. Okay. Now, you'll notice here that we have two different websites. Our foundation website is episcopalfoundation.org. Our resources, our webinars, our articles, tools are available at ecfvp.org. So, Carsten, Demi, do you have any final thoughts before we leave today?
Well, I'll just leave you with this. We are very happy to have a conversation with you about issues you face now or about planning for your future. So it's our great delight and joy always to hear from individual churches. And so we would be very happy to hear from you.
Yes, and your biggest safeguard against those dangerous shortcuts is to be in community, in relationship, in conversation with other people in your congregation, other leaders and people who are not in leadership positions, because they are the heartbeat of your congregation and they will help guide you in your decision making. We really appreciate all of you. We are here to be in conversation with you in the way that you choose. Email, phone us, however it works. We want to walk alongside you as you deal with these really disruptive and difficult times. So call us. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Carsten.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please stay up to date with our webinar calendar. As we said, there'll be another webinar, Carsten, June 10th?
Yes.
Right, June 10th. Will be a second webinar in this series. So please, we hope to see you back again. Have a lovely day, whether it's morning, noon, or night where you happen to be. Please be safe, be well, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.